Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, whatever time you are listening to us. Welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. I'm Sam. We have Dee here, we have James, we have John. Thanks for joining us on this conversation. We're going through a book by Eugene Peterson. Dee, if you could hold it up for us, please. It's called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, and we'd love for you to join us. If you go to the description, you'll be able to have a link to the book and you can buy it and tag along the conversation with us. We'd love you to be able to leave your comments. We think that this is a book that really does have some nuggets, and we want to share some of those nuggets with you today. And we want to have this conversation about chapter 3 specifically. The title of the chapter is Providence. God guards you from every evil. Let's start with the psalm that we're actually going to talk about, or Song of Ascent, if you were, as we've been educated by Peterson, a bunch of psalms that the Jews took on their way up to the summit of Jerusalem. And the psalm that we are going to look at, a very popular psalm, one of my favorites, Psalms 121. Dee, would you mind reading the psalm for us before we get stuck in?
Sure. It says, I look up to the mountains. Does my strength come from mountains? No, my strength comes from God, who made heaven and earth and mountains. He won't let you stumble. Your guardian God won't fall asleep, not on your life. Israel's guardian will never doze or sleep. God's your guardian, right at your side to protect you, shielding you from sunstroke, sheltering you from moonstroke. God guards you from every evil. He guards you your very life. He guards you when you leave, when you return. He guards you now. He guards you always. Psalm 121.
So this chapter is pretty much, if you want, a response to Psalms 121 by Eugene Peterson. He kind of starts off, I like the way he starts off. He starts off kind of lulling us into the fable of what many Christians do believe about what happens when you have this really close relationship with God. And in a nutshell, our lives are perfect. We never have issues. We never stumble. You don't argue with your spouse or your partner. You don't have issues regarding finance or difficult decisions regarding your children. All your children listen to you and take on every single word that you say as like a golden nugget. He continues to describe this fable of a reality, which kind of exposes a little bit of the basic assumptions that many people have, that if you follow God, everything is going to be okay. Let me start by saying this. I think I have, for a very long time in my life, conceptually understood that to be false. I get it. I get the understanding that if you follow God, everything is not going to be okay. I get the fact that just because you follow God, bad things won't, just because you follow God, bad things are bound to happen to you as a result of this life that we live in. That's conceptually. I find myself, however, on many occasions, even though after years and years and years that has been cemented into my brain, that when I get into chaos or trials or issues or worries or confusions, I do find myself sometimes in the back of my head questioning, well, Sam, how close are you to God right now? Like, what's your spiritual condition? If you were to do a litmus test, Sam, if we were to work out how good of a Christian are you, how would you fare? And I think sometimes the difference between the concept and the reality is that there are a few times in my life that I sometimes pause and make a correlation between the quality of my faith and the quality of my actual life, as in its circumstances. That happens sometimes. And I have been thinking and wondering why that is. Before I give my own personal answer, let me just throw the question out to you guys. Are you guys with me? Do you experience those times, or is it completely different for you?
Wait, did you just say that your faith or your belief in God goes up and down based on what's happening in your life? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that there are some times in my life that I
You
find
have that
myself
experience, you're saying.
thinking that my faith correlates with the circumstances that happen in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's human nature to have that happen as a Christian. And I mean, he starts out this chapter a little bit tongue in cheek, like, everything's going to be perfect if you follow God. And I think, we all live in a very imperfect world. And I think it gets a lot easier when you realize that. And then you could almost take the next step. I mean, any good Christian in a lot of ways is going to have a target on his back for Satan and all the forces of evil in a lot of ways. And so in some ways, you could argue it might even be worse as a good Christian in this world.
Yep, I guess so. Anyone else? Similar thoughts, different thoughts?
This one is a little tougher for me to relate to because I've always divorced the two.
Okay.
I don't know why, but I've never correlated bad things happening with, oh, okay, that means my relationship with God is not good. It's just I've always been independent for me, but my problem more has been, well, when the bad times happen, do I turn to God or do I turn to myself to get myself out of that mud hole? Yeah, that's been more my challenge, and I think he'll talk about it a little bit later in this book, but
Sure.
or a chapter, but yeah.
D, any similarities or differences for you?
No, I don't think my experience like that, but there been a one incident in my life where a friend of mine had miscarriage. Uh, I think she was far into her far enough that the fetus was already formed, and she had a miscarriage. And anyway, and then she got pregnant again, maybe a couple years or a year or whatever later. And I actually consciously talked to God, saying in my prayer, I was like, God, if anything happens to this baby, the second pregnancy, if anything happens, I don't know if I'm going to be able to trust you. That I remember that thought process in my head, and that's only honestly the only thing I can remember. I think because it was such a detrimental experience for a friend, and yeah.
I get that.
Mm-hmm.
I get that. For me, I think one of the reasons why I sometimes do fall into that trap is because by trap I mean correlating the quality of my faith with the circumstances of my life, is because it's not just about the Christian framing that takes place in today's society, but I also think it's about how the Bible has been presented to us in very different ways, and how God is presented to us as a vicious dictator who looks over us, wagging his finger, waiting for us to mess up. And it's difficult. I'm not going to say it's easy. I think it's difficult because we are inundated with lots of stories in the Bible. I'm currently preaching a series on Jeremiah, where God is making things quite clear. If you do this and you follow my laws, and if you do everything that I tell you to do, you will be safe. You will be looked after. And I think the working through of framing that kind of theology is challenging when it's not done well. Eugene Peterson flips the script on its head by expressing the finding out that God doesn't connect the two worlds or divorce the two worlds, as James said, is good news. And I like how he presents the notion of it can finally free you from the reality that God is that kind of God, but a God who rather is interested in so much more. than what you think he's interested in. Later on, Eugene Peterson mentions a couple of things when we get into the nitty-gritty of Psalms 21, where the individual who's writing talks about looking to the hills or the mountains and where my help comes from. I do find myself sometimes not immediately turning to God when chaos hits.
Right. I
find myself trying to solve the scenario or situation because I feel I have the agency, and I feel like, you know, if I just ask this person, or if I just go to this website, or if I just have this conversation, I'll be able to solve everything that I need to solve. I can't say that I have a habit of problem immediately come to God and connect with him. Is that a similar experience to you guys, or different, would you say?
I feel like I've gone through, honestly, this is 20, you know, my life up to 2011, up to end of 2011 was like, well, up to 2011, okay, there was that right before 2011 or end of 2011 when something happened in our life. Up to that point, well, a few months before that, prior to that, I was having this conversation in my head, like thinking, okay, life cannot be this good. Okay, it just cannot be. We live in this, evil world, and up to that point, I mean, not that things didn't happen in my life, but up to that point, my life was just comfortable. And honestly speaking, it's gotten to the point where I myself felt like this is too comfortable. This cannot last. Okay, and then at the end of 2011, something happened in our life that, anyway, yeah. And then since 2011, just things keep happening in our lives that just keeps. It's just, yeah. Anyway,
It's changed your perspective on suffering?
Well, I think that now it's gotten about 10 plus years now. I just feel like it's gotten me the place where I just turn to God just immediately.
Okay.
It just, yeah. And not that I'm not at the same time, but trying to work things through. Of course, we all do that, right? But
right.
Yeah,
I hear that. James or John, any thoughts?
Well, but I'm kind of agree with James. Is like a lot of times the first thing you look at is how to get out of the trouble that you're in. And some of that is just self-preservation, I think, and it's not necessarily an ungodly thing to do. But there's certainly trouble that you get into that becomes a habit, I think, and then you don't go to God intentionally. And I think I'm learning more and trying to do more things with God as opposed to for God.
Yeah.
And I think that applies here when there's trouble, am I going to get out of trouble by myself, or am I going to get out of trouble with God and his, will and in what and how he wants me to get out of that trouble. I mean, I'm being a little bit vague because I don't have anything specific, I guess.
No, but I understand that. James, did you want to weigh in?
Well, no, I totally agree. I think sometimes kind of going a little further with this idea we're talking about is, I think, we know we've been taught so much. We know that we can turn to God, but I think where sometimes for me also it becomes a problem is sometimes I don't turn to him even in the small things or the common banal things of life. I don't think to normally. But Eugene Peterson, he had a good quote on, well, in my book, page 38, where he says, the only serious mistake we can make is that God's interest waxes and wanes in us in response to our spiritual oh, not that one, sorry.
No, that was a good quote.
Yeah, that's a good quote too.
I highlighted that too.
But there's a quote where he talks about the common things of life, and we all go through everyday routine, but where he says something to the effect that, well, but a mistake is that we think that he would have no interest or bother with that, or that God is irrelevant in those matters. But um, going back to that Psalms 121 theme of, we tend to look at the mountains, and I didn't realize till he pointed this out that often back then in ancient Israel times they put idols up on those hilltops and mountains. So in other words, they're looking at other sources of the big picture of in their lives, the power that they turn to run their lives. Yeah, and so that really struck me.
Yeah. How did you guys reconcile, obviously having read the chapter, but how did you guys reconcile Peterson's handling of, I guess, the question, like, in Psalms 21, it says stuff like, he won't let you stumble. Your guardian God won't fall asleep, not on your life. Israel's guardian will never doze nor sleep. And then it will say, shielding you from sunstroke or moonstroke. Like, the reality is, you could read this psalm to say, nothing bad is going to happen to you. How did you reconcile how Eugene Peterson handled that? And for your own self, how do you reconcile a God who apparently won't let these things happen to you, but these things do happen to you in your life?
Well,
Go ahead, John.
well, just real quick. I mean, he mentions Elijah and Baal. And I think in a lot of ways, if you put this into context in ancient Israel, and this is again one of the Psalms of Ascent. So as people are approaching the temple, that very specifically, the middle of the Psalm where he says, Israel's will not, doze or sleep is in a lot of ways a direct reference to Baal, who is a god of fertility. So, he's the one you worship to have the rains of spring come along and help the crops come along. And then as things warm up, all of a sudden, where did he go? Well, he's dozing and or sleeping. And that's kind of what Elijah was making fun of.
Yep.
And I think it's kind of mentioned here. And I mean, you got a nation of people that are following God, but in a lot of ways, they're embedded with other people that do worship this type of God and certainly have superstitions, if not directly related to Baal, at least indirectly related to Baal. And so I think, that's kind of how I took it.
Okay.
Dee, what were you going to say?
No, okay, so in the Psalm itself, 121, verse there, God guards you from every evil, right? He guards your very life. For me personally, out of all the scriptures in the Bible, everything that's said in the Bible, this statement has the most trouble for me. And it has the most trouble for me because, not because it affects my belief or my faith in God, it doesn't, but because I am not able to explain this to other people. I'm not able to explain this especially to unbelievers. How am I going to explain this, right? And that's for me, this is the biggest problem that I have, okay? And I think in reading this chapter, and I was trying very hard to understand, okay, how do I reconcile this, right, in my mind finally, right? And I'm not 100% if he did it for me or not, but what I understood from this chapter is that I think that where does it say that? He says that God is going to preserve you, keep you from evil. And I think the evil that he's talking about, the evil as in, or that whatever bad happens, whatever evil things that happen in your life, it is not going to separate you from God. Like it's talking about, I think, your spirituality, your heart matter and your relationship with God. I think that's what I understood.
I
So
think
am I
So
understanding this?
the quote you're looking for is a page before the one that James mentioned. It says the promise of the psalm, and I'll skip
Where
some
is
of
what
the stuff.
page?
The
Page
promise of the
36.
psalm
Okay.
is not that we shall never stub our toes, but that no injury, no illness, no accident, no distress will have evil power over us. That is, will be able to separate us from God's purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's terribly comforting. I mean, it basically says bad things can happen, but it's not going to separate you from God.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think that's where a lot of where he try to hits home on a main thing on the main part of this chapter. James, did you want to add anything?
I'll just add one quote. Yes, there's some good quotes. It's in page 37. All the water in the oceans cannot sink a ship unless it gets inside. Similarly, nor can all the troubles in the world harm us unless it gets within us. And I think that's where God's rule comes. He fortifies my heart and my soul so that that does not harm me within. The best example I can give is I grew up in New York, moving around, and I got picked on a lot, bullied, and I dreaded life. I hated school. Um, and I even once like fell on the cement playground. You know, I got pushed. I got stitches. I still have a scar there. But more than the physical harm, the literal physical harm, was the emotional trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember once my grandmother came to visit from Korea. She passed away 3 years ago. And she told me, and she knew what was going on because I was a shy kid and it was obvious. And she just like, James, tell me who's bullying you. I'm going to go over, I'm going to beat the crap out of them. Okay. I'm translating in Korean to English. Okay. Paraphrasing. And okay, she never did that. Of course, I would have been horrified if my grandma went over and beat one of my classmates up. But just the fact that she said that and that she was willing to tell me that she was right by my side, that meant all the world. I could face tomorrow because of that moral courage and support. And that's really where I see God, what God is doing for us as he shares this to David in Psalms 121, that, yeah, bad things are still going to happen, but he's not going to let that get inside of me. He's not going to let that water get inside the boat and sink it. Mm-hmm.
It's a value that this world will challenge is untenable, because this world has placed so much value on the physical and and also we have an emotional connection to suffering that we see and experience in people that we love. And I'm talking about others, and I'm talking about ourselves as well. The reality is we hate suffering. I don't think there's anyone who loves suffering, but I think the challenge for the person who wants to follow the way of Jesus is to cross over this huge bridge of recognizing that the internal is more valuable than the external. I think that's very hard for someone to do who has their entire lives characterized their life fully on the external. It's not that I'm saying that the physical doesn't matter. It's not that I'm saying that there isn't anything that we should try to do to soften the blows of suffering, but there is some kind of unmeasurable power found in someone who cannot be shaken internally. Maybe that's why it's so difficult to explain it to non-believers, D, as you mentioned before, because if it's just hard I think the chasm between an atheist and someone who believes in God is huge. And the concept of, I love the stars and stuff, and maybe sometimes I geek out on the planets and stuff here and there, but the Milky Way itself is so huge that it takes approximately 100,000 years at the speed of light to travel from one side to the other side of the Milky Way. Like, even just processing that is just mind-blowing, that out of all of that, God created this one world, this one planet. And if you zoom in even further, you get into America, you get into Washington, and then he sees me, and he places value and meaning on that. it can't be just about the physical. There's so much more to life's dimensions than there's just the realities of what we feel on a daily basis. And I think that Eugene Peterson and this psalm is really just pointing us to the value of what does it mean for a God to guard us from evil. And very, very often we translate that to, oh, it means that we won't get our homes robbed. But actually, I think that what God is trying to get across in this psalm is, which I think is doubly more powerful. I think what God is trying to say, it means that we won't get our hearts robbed because there is someone who is standing at the core of who we are, protecting us every step of the way. Any other thoughts, quotes that you wanted to mention that was quite powerful for you guys? I did like the whole boat on the water analogy and how the water didn't get into the boat. I thought that was quite relevant and a good picture for us to take away from. Anything else that you guys wanted to mention?
I like the first sentence in the last paragraph. It says, Psalms 121, learned early and sung repeatedly in the walk with Christ, clearly defines the conditions under which we live out our discipleship, which, in a word, is God. And I think that's what it's like you're saying. I mean, God is our creator, and so he is all powerful and controls all things. And he is our savior, which, it's like you're saying, he loves us, each one of us individually, more than anyone else could possibly love us.
Right.
And so he's looking for, our love in return, but he's willing to keep that connection if we're willing to keep it with him.
Right. Right. Anyone else before we wrap things up? Okay. If not, there's a final quote that I share. It's the very last few lines of this chapter, which I thought was just summed up everything so well. It is the solid, massive, secure experience of God who keeps all evil from getting inside us, who guards our life, who guards us when we leave and when we return, who guards us now and who guards us always. I guess my prayer after reading this psalm is that we all can experience a new set of eyes when we start reading things like Psalms 121, and when we hear God talking about the idea that he's going to be there for us, he's going to protect us, he's going to use different physical analogies. My prayer is that we're able to really get to the root of it and understand. You only guard someone's heart if you feel like there is something great of value to be guarded. There's no point of guarding something that has no value inside. And that speaks more about what God thinks about us than what we think about ourselves. And I think that's quite remarkable. We want to thank you so much for joining us on the journey for Pages to Progress. Next week, we are going to dive into chapter 4, entitled Worship. Let's go to the house of God. Obviously, the next song of ascent will be Psalms 122. And we've loved going through this, and we look forward to going to more conversation. Click the link in the description and you'll be able to get the book. Come on the journey with us. We would love to experience your comments, your thoughts, your ideas. But until next week, we wish you God's richest blessings. Take care. Bye-bye.